I'd like to welcome you all here this evening for Tim's inaugural lecture. I'm Phil Gilmartin. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Science with responsibility for the Faculty of Science, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the Julian Study Centre. And for those of you who are joining us via live stream, welcome wherever you are. And those who are watching it online at some point in the future, welcome wherever and whenever you are. So, it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Tim Osborn this evening. Tim was born in Malden in Essex a few weeks before the humans first walked on the moon in 1969. He was educated at Brentwood County High School, a state school that provided both an excellent education and a wonderful range of extracurricular outdoor pursuits which took Tim from the Pyrenees to the West Highland Way. Tim turned down a place to study geophysics at Durham because the course was too geological, opting instead to come to UEA because its geophysical sciences degree truly was the physics of the whole Earth and included study of the atmosphere and oceans and not just the solid Earth. This proved to be a good decision because Tim's interest moved much more towards oceanography and then on to the climate. After graduating with a first-class honours degree from the School of Environmental Sciences here at UEA, he joined the school's climatic research unit in September 1990 as a research associate. He was under the supervision of then director, Professor Tom Wigley. Tim embarked on a part-time PhD to study how slow variations in the global ocean circulation might cause natural changes in our climate on century timescales. With the exception of a few months at Scripps Institute for Oceanography in California, Tim has continued his career here in the Climatic Research Unit at UEA. After 15 years as a research scientist, Tim was awarded an academic fellowship in 2005, which provided a 5-year transition to his current academic role, which combines teaching, research, and academic leadership. Along the way, he has authored or co-authored over 100 papers that have appeared in peer-reviewed journals or books. On average, each of these has been cited by other scientists almost 90 times. Tim was awarded the Hugh Robert Mill Medal by the Royal Meteorological Society in 2002 for his research into rainfall variability, including a demonstration that heavy rainfall events had increased in the UK over the course of the 20th century. He's also been a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Tim's career in the Climatic Research Unit has benefited from all of the unit's directors, and the founding director, Hubert Lamb, still active when Tim joined in 1990, through Tom Wigley, Trevor Davies, Jean Poludikov, and Phil Jones. A year ago, Tim became the unit's 6th director. Tim's research is concerned with identifying variations in climate as observed and recorded in climate proxies and as simulated by climate models, and understanding their causes in terms of natural and anthropogenic climate processes. This understanding provides the basis for making predictions of future climate change. Tonight, Tim is going to share his thoughts with us on probing past climates using trees and thermometers. Please join me now in welcoming Professor Tim Osborn for his inaugural lecture. Tim.
Thank you, Phil. I'm actually going to start by carrying on the biography a little bit, just to say how I've got here, because it's a way of me also thanking some of the people who have helped me along the way. So as a teenager in the 1980s, included this photograph to remind my wife what I used to look like. I didn't know what to do. Our school careers teacher had one of these newfangled computer systems to help guide your career choices, and I answered many seemingly irrelevant questions and nothing suitable came out. And then, what are your favourite subjects? Well, geography and physics, of course. Out popped from the computer, you should be a geophysicist. Which seems obvious, geography and physics together, but actually I'd never heard of geophysics. I didn't know that you could apply your maths and your physics and your scientific understanding to explain the real world and go beyond the more descriptive aspects of geography that I'd encountered up to there. So, that's what I still do now, still the physics of the Earth and the atmosphere, but I started off, as Phil said, by doing an undergraduate degree here, and I was inspired by many different scientists. I know some of them are here today. I've seen Fred in the audience, for example, and lots of experiences. These are the last two pictures of bare-chested men in the talk. So after my undergraduate degree, I began as a researcher in the Climatic Research Unit, and I did my PhD, but I was also working full-time as a researcher, which is what you needed to do in order to get married, buy a house, start a family, etc. They couldn't really survive on the low PhD stipends they had back then. So I did my PhD, and some of you, I'm looking at the audience, mostly older than PhD students, I'm guessing, but some of you may be embarking on a PhD at the moment, and so a little bit of advice is that they have their ups and downs. For me, the down point was kind of December 1993, when the computer model simulation that I've been working on, the main data set for my PhD, it had taken a year to run on the supercomputer, and it turned out to be rubbish, unusable. And at the same time, my contract was coming to an end, and our research proposal to extend it was rejected. My wife was made redundant because she was pregnant with our first daughter, so it wasn't a great time. But fortunately, to my rescue came my supervisor, Tom Wigley, also Tim Barnett at Scripps Oceanography in La Jolla, and also help from Trevor Davies here at UEA, the then director of the unit. And we found a new model, new data set, funding for me to work in Scripps for a few months, and success. Another daughter. And a PhD as well. So after my PhD, I worked with a number of amazing colleagues here at UEA and also around the world, to be honest. Some of them mentioned here. There's too many people to mention everyone by name. I'll probably just mention my colleague Keith Priffer, who's the mentor and inspiration behind much of the triggering work that I've done. So, that was the end of the biography. What's happened to our climate system since I was born? This is 1969. The lunar lander coming back up to Apollo 11, taking a photograph of the Earth. What's happened to the Earth since then? Our atmospheric CO2 has risen to levels not seen for more than 2.5 million years. This is a massive geophysical experiment we're conducting with our climate system, taking this carbon that's been locked away over hundreds of millions of years in the fossil fuels and adding it to the atmosphere in just hundreds of years. Global temperature had already risen by about 1/3 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times, up to that point, and since then it's risen by another 0.7 degrees Celsius. Are those two things linked? Is that the only cause of global warming? Well, let's just turn briefly to what the IPCC have said about the matter. So the IPCC have been in existence for more than half of my life. Happy birthday, IPCC. They're celebrating it today, 30th birthday. And UEA, out of all the universities around the world, has made the longest and most consistent and most widest across disciplines contribution to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change across the years. So more than 50 chapters in all these assessment reports have had a co-author from UEA on them. So let's look at some of the statements they've made based upon assessing the scientific knowledge at the time and how they've evolved. So 1990 is very much the case that yes, the warming we're observing is consistent with what we expect from the rise in greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, but it's still of a similar magnitude to natural variability. As you can see, the statement strengthened over time. 1995, a human influence was discernible, but still emerging from the noise of natural variability. Jump forward to 2007, most of the observed increase since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic, so human-related greenhouse gas concentrations. In 2013, human influence on the climate system is clear. So all of these statements require a knowledge of past climate. What's happened in the past, what's caused it, combination of human effects and natural effects, and how good are climate models at simulating the climate system? Can we test that against the past? So that's the context for my lecture today, is how do we know the past? And I'm going to talk especially about true rings, but I'm going to first of all talk about instrumental temperatures, the global temperature record from thermometer measurements, which of course we're very well known for here at UEA, because in concert with the Met Office, we produce one of the most well-known and well-used global temperature estimates around the world. And this is what it looks like, up to date. You can see the individual yearly points in the black circles, and they have an error bar, vertical lines, and then we have the longer-term fluctuations, the decadal changes in blue with their narrower uncertainty range. So what can we learn from this? That's going to be the theme of each of my examples. What can we learn from them? And, of course, you can learn how much the overall temperature rise has been, just over a degree Celsius since the 19th century. Perhaps you look at the structure, the timing of these warming phases. But actually underlying this, there's a lot more information. We can look at the spatial patterns. Here we've got the example for the last 4 years. Each of these is a map of the temperature anomaly, the difference between the temperature at that location and the average temperature for that location, taken over 1961 to 1990. So these are not absolute temperatures, but temperature changes. And you can see some interesting information in those patterns. Now, what happens if we were to take each row at a particular latitude and average all those values together to get the temperature value for that particular latitude? Repeat that from South Pole to North. We would condense one of these maps into a single column of temperature for that year, from the South Pole through the tropics to the North Pole. And then let's say we do that for every year from 1850 to the present, and stack those vertical columns of temperatures up side by side. We produce what's called a Hoff-Muller diagram, a diagram that has time on one axis and some spatial variation on the other, in this case, the latitude. So we can see some of the rich nature of the temperature changes, not just the overall warming, but some of the variability and what latitudes are affected. You can see some occasional warm years throughout the record associated with El Nino events, occasional warming of the tropical Pacific Ocean, which you can see here. Can you see the, yes, excellent. My laser pointer doesn't work on the screen, unfortunately. So these kind of El Nino events and more recent ones as well. And then let's take 1960 and look at the amount of warming that's occurred at each latitude from 1960 to the present, the period when the most recent phase of warming has been underway. And again, there's structure in this. This is shown here, and you can see the greater warming at the higher latitudes. And this structure is important because when we increase greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it doesn't respond uniformly. There are various physical mechanisms that determine the pattern of warming you get. And we understand those. That's a good way of testing our models and our understanding. So we've got Arctic amplification. We do the same analysis, but looking at the temperatures from the oceans and over the land separately. We get the red and the blue curves. Again, it's a mechanism we understand. Warming over land is about 1.5 times as much as over the oceans. If we take the oceans themselves, the blue curve here, you can see that in the subpolar oceans, kind of 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south, there's less warming than the surrounding latitudes. Again, that's a mechanism we understand, and it links back to my PhD on how ocean variability can influence the climate on long timescales. So I'm going to finish off with the temperature section to consider, is the temperature record reliable? And in particular, one aspect of it is, if we don't have temperature observations everywhere, then can we get a good estimate of the global average temperature? And the answer is that yes, we can, and partly it relies upon random versus systematic errors. I put random in quotes because nothing is truly random, but by random I mean things which are different between observations taken at different locations or observations taken at different times. And if they're different, then when you average those things together, those errors can cancel out. On the other hand, if they're systematic errors affecting all the observations in a similar manner, then averaging won't necessarily help us. So, as my example here, I've got the pattern of where the stations are, the weather stations are, that have observations in 3 Januaries, 1875, 1900, 2010. You may be surprised at the number of stations observing monthly temperatures back in the 19th century, 425. It's quite a large number. But the distribution is rather clustered over USA and Europe. Much better in the present day. And what we can do is we can take each pair of stations randomly, choose a pair of 2 stations randomly, calculate the correlation between those 2 stations. So correlation is a measure of similarity, with a value of 1 meaning they're behaving identically, 0 meaning there's no relationship, and if it's negative, it means when one warms, the other gets colder. And we can plot those correlations against the separation distance between our pair of stations, and repeat this for the millions of combinations of pairs that you can get out of the data set. And that's what's shown at the top left there. There's so many of them, you can't really see where the most densest cluster of those locations is, but I've conveniently added some curves, and 50% of those grey dots lie between the lower and the upper of those thin lines, between the 25th and the 75th percentile. So that gives us a good measure of the correlation between stations as you move the stations further apart. And again, it's quite surprising, I think, that even if you go 1,000 kilometres apart, monthly temperatures are correlated between those different locations. So let's take a correlation of 0.5. So 50% of the station pairs have a correlation of 0.5 or higher, even if you separate them by more than 1,200 kilometres. So let's put circles of 1,200 kilometre radius around each of our weather stations, and you get an idea of the region that those measurements are representative of. So we've got good coverage here, and I should say that this is just the land temperatures on these maps. We have many observations over the oceans of the sea surface temperatures. In fact, in the 19th century, there's more sea surface temperature data than land, so we're actually doing quite well for the oceans. But for land, you would say that for individual months, we wouldn't necessarily be confident in our temperature data for, certainly not for Antarctica and certainly not for some of the southern continents. So let's repeat that analysis, but first of all, instead of months, we're going to take yearly averages of temperature first. So we're averaging in time, and some of the error that's non-systematic will cancel out, and the correlations grow stronger. And now you've got to go out to nearly 1,500 kilometres before the correlation drops to 0.5. If we grow the circles to have the diameter of 1476, sorry, radius 1476 kilometres, then obviously they get a bit bigger and the coverage looks somewhat better for years. If we repeat that, but we take decadal averages, even more averaging goes on and the correlations grow stronger, and now even out more than 2,500 kilometres apart, the decadal temperatures measured at one location are correlated strongly with the decadal temperatures measured even 2,500 kilometres away. And circles of that size now start to give us coverage over all the continents apart from Antarctica. And Antarctica, of course, covered in the modern period. So this is why we can claim to have a good estimate, at least of the decadal fluctuations in temperature, right back into the 19th century. And that's the end of temperature. I'm now going to cover things about going further back in time. So even though we didn't have thermometers invented to make records, natural archives have been recording conditions about their environment over the years. And we can now go back and sample those archives and take measurements and infer something about their environment. The focus here will be on tree rings. And what is a tree ring? Well, they are the annual growth rings. You can see the lines here on this Douglas fir. They're the annual growth rings of a tree. If we look under the microscope, we can start to see why they show up as these alternating light and dark bands. You can see the gradation of colour from the pale growth laid down early in the growing season, gradually gets darker, and you get the distinct change at the end of the growing season to the next spring when it goes lighter again, and that allows us to measure the width of those rings. Zooming in even further, you can see the makeup of this. These are the individual cells of wood, and as you go from the early part of the growing season, you've got larger cells with thinner cell walls. So the walls of the cells are orange in this slide. And as you go through to the later part of the growing season, the cells get smaller and their walls get thicker. So this affects the colour, allows us to see the rings, but also affects the density. So here we've got an X-ray photograph of a sample through 5 annual rings, and here the denser wood is coloured white and the less dense is black. So again, you can see the wood getting denser as you go through the growing season. And at the bottom here is a trace of the density during one of those rings. And you see it drops at the very start from the previous year down to the start of this growing season, and then it gradually increases to a peak that we call the maximum late wood density. I mention this because MXD, maximum late wood density, is one of the key variables we use, as well as the width of the individual rings. So I'm going to tell you about 3 amazing data sets and what we can learn from them, but kind of behind the scenes, you need to have reliable records, otherwise it's pointless inferring anything from them. And initially you would think that of all the archives you could look at, tree rings perhaps would not be what you would choose because they have some severe disadvantages, especially that they are biological organisms, they have a life cycle, they respond to multiple influences, some from the climate, temperature, water, sunlight, etc., and some non-climatic influences, competition from other trees, pests, etc. So these are going to really complicate what we can learn from tree rings, but on the other hand, they have some really good advantages as well. So resolution, you've got values every individual year from each tree ring. Precise dating, this is really important because if you've got values which are precisely dated, you can take samples from different locations, and if you know that that each of these rings grew in the same year, you can average them together and you can start to cancel out some of our random errors again. So you can reduce the non-systematic influences. And you can get trees, there's lots of trees in the forest. You can sample them. So you can get lots of samples, and that can help you not just to reduce the non-systematic errors and influences, but also when you have got systematic errors that affect one whole population of data, you can compare it against data from another environment and see if you understand the cause of those differences. So this is really important, and a particular way we can minimize the cons, the disadvantages, is to sample near the margins of the ecological range. So tree species, they will grow within a certain range of climates, and if you go to the extreme climate, so for example, to the high latitudes, to the tree line, where trees are only just surviving because it's so cold. They grow in the summer when it's briefly warm enough, and they're only at the margins of survival, and therefore they really care about how warm it is in the summertime. And they care less about if it's slightly wetter or drier than last year. And so that reduces the number of multiple influences, and at the same time, each of the trees are responding to the same thing, to the summer temperature. So therefore they can be dated against each other much better because the common signal is stronger. So that's what we do. So if you're interested in temperature, then you would go to the summer temperature limit. And by the wonders of Google Earth, hopefully we can take a visit to the northern tree line in Canada. And you can see the darker colours where the forest is, and then the slightly greyer, paler colours where it's tundra. So these trees are really at the edge of their survival limits. And this is where ideally you'd like to go. And I say go, I mean I haven't been to these places. I'm a data person. As we'll see, I rely upon excellent colleagues who have been collecting data sets from these fairly harsh environments over many years. So that's where you may go. Alternatively, you could go not to the northern tree line, but to the elevational tree line. If you go up the mountainside, again, you find a height above which it's too cold for the trees to survive. And the trees there, just below the tree line, which you can hopefully see on the mountainside there, the trees below that will really care about the summer temperature and less about other things. So that's our sampling strategy. And like I said before, we rely upon data sets that have been assembled by other colleagues and scientists around the world. And the first one we're going to talk about is what we call the Schweingruber network. So Fritz Schweingruber and colleagues at WSL Bermensdorf in Switzerland assembled this over many years, even decades. There are 2 million rings approximately measured for width and maximum lakewood density. So those X-ray photographs digitized for all those 2 million rings across these 400 sites that you can see on the map here. So these sites, as you probably can tell, have been sampled deliberately to try and estimate the summer temperature, because they're all either at the far northern latitudes or they're at mountain ranges in the Rockies and the Alps, the Pyrenees, etc. So we would expect that these tree ring records would tell us something about summer temperature. So we can take a correlation between the observed summer temperature in the 20th century and the measured tree ring data, in this case the density of the wood in each ring. And you can see the correlations here. More than half of the trees have a correlation of around about 0.5 or higher with their summer temperature. That is good for a proxy. Many proxies are much more noisy and limited than that. A few of them are lower. As you can see, there's some yellows below 0.2, but generally this is an excellent data set. And this is all about agreement at the year-to-year and decade-to-decade timescales. So with half of them of the correlation about 0.5, that's pretty good. If you average them into regions or even into the whole hemisphere, again, some of the limitations due to non-systematic random errors will cancel out. And so what happens is the correlation grows. If you take a northern hemisphere average, the correlation rises to about 0.7. And this is what we get. From 1400 to the present, each red or blue bar, warmer or cooler, or higher density or lower density than average, tells us about the summer temperature conditions in that year. So what can we learn from this? Well, I'm going to come on to this unusual drop in the late 20th century in a few moments. First of all, we're going to look at some of these spikes. You can see there are some downward spikes, which I've labelled the years of, where you've got particularly low density from which we infer particularly cool summers. And if I overlay at the bottom here the timing of the largest volcanic eruptions that we know of in the last 600 years, you can see that there is a correspondence between many of them and the cool summers. So you've got Juana Patina in the Andes in 1600, and one summer later, 1601, you get the spike. You've got Tambora in 1815, and then 1816, 17 cooler summers. Krakatoa, 1883, and then 1884, the following summer, is the cooling. So this tells us something about the climate system we would like to know. Volcanic eruptions cool the climate. Like with the global temperature record, there's a lot of information behind this. We've got this spatial network, and therefore we can look at the sequence of maps, all based upon our tree ring density data. And again, the colours give us some indication of whether the temperatures in the summertime were cooler or warmer than average. And you can see mixed patterns. Some patches are warm, some patches are cool as we go through the years. And then Tambora erupts. Some cooling begins already in northern Siberia, but then by 1816 it's much more uniform across the whole network. Another thing we can do, which is quite informative to put space and time together, is to take an average around these longitudes. So we're looking at the temperature around the mid to high latitudes of the hemisphere, from North America across to Europe and across to Northern Asia. And we could do that for each of these and reduce each map to a horizontal line of temperature anomalies. And then again, we can stack those up to produce a sequence, time going up this time, and longitude on the left. So we've got North America here, Europe here, and Asia here. And again, this is an indication of the temperatures across the across the data set. There's lots we can learn from that. The space-time correlation with what we observed with thermometers is again reasonably good, 0.7. And one thing we can do is to say, well, now we've got this evidence about how much summer temperatures cool after volcanic eruptions, do our climate models that we use to predict future climate, do they also simulate the right amount of cooling after a volcanic eruption? If you put in the stratospheric aerosol that comes out of a volcano and has this cooling effect on the climate by scattering the sun's radiation back to space, you can put that forcing factor into our climate models and you end up simulating a response to that eruption. And these show an aggregate over a number of different volcanic events. The red curve with the shading is the results from our climate models. The black curve with the pale grey shading are the results from a number of different temperature reconstructions for the Northern Hemisphere. Our one that was shown on the previous graph, and some others that are a bit less good than ours, which is true, because they smear things out, which is partly, I think, why the agreement, although it's approximately there, is not that perfect. The temperature in the models tends to drop more rapidly and more by a greater amount than in some of the reconstructions. The agreement with ours is a bit closer because ours captures that sharp transition quite well. So this is from the IPCC that I was a co-author on last time round, and we also looked at, instead of individual eruptions, multi-decadal periods where volcanoes were generally more active. And again, we see a cooling in those periods that's comparable with our climate model simulations. And similarly for periods where the sun is thought to have been less active in the past. Again, some agreements. The magnitude is small because we don't think the sun has actually varied much in the past 1,000 years. So I said I'd come back to this unusual drop at the end of that record, and we published a paper on this in 1998, and I looked today, it's been cited by other scientists nearly 500 times. The median number of times a paper of that age is cited is probably around 20, so it's had a big influence on the field. And this is an example of it. In black, we've got the observed temperature in Sweden. Sorry. We have the observed temperature summer temperature in Sweden, and we have in red from that location there our tree ring density record, and there's this small divergence between the two at the end. Doesn't seem like a big deal. How can that difference between the red and blue curves for the period after 1950 doesn't seem very large. Why would someone cite that nearly 500 times? Well, this is an example where errors, when they're systematic, are bad. So the errors that are non-systematic, random, they can cancel out when you average lots of data together. If the error affects lots of locations at once, averaging doesn't help you. So let's now average across all those sites in Northern Europe. And we have the temperature and the average density, and now you can see a somewhat bigger divergence between the two, with the temperatures above what the tree ring data are recording in the last few decades. And if you take the whole hemisphere, then it becomes clearer still. I didn't have to hand a graph with red and black. The thick line is the tree ring density, and the thin line is the observed temperatures. And I've shaded in the difference so you can see visually how that grows over time. So that was the basis of our paper, just pointing this out. We didn't have an explanation for it. And one thing which, therefore, we need to be aware of is, does this invalidate our supposedly wonderful reconstruction of past climate for the last 600 years? Because if this goes wrong at the end, then perhaps earlier on our record is also going wrong. I mean, there's a few reasons and potential explanations, and they kind of fall into three categories. One is that this is something specific to this data set at the end of it. Maybe it's related to the sapwood having lower density than the heartwood. Maybe it's related to the thinner rings, aliasing the peak of the density that we're measuring. So very narrow rings, it's harder to measure that peak. Secondly, perhaps it's a real effect, but it only arises in the modern warm period. perhaps because some other influence, like scattering from the reduction in sunshine because of the increase in aerosols in the atmosphere from our burning of fossil fuels and biomass. Either of those two effects doesn't invalidate the earlier reconstruction because they're just unique to the modern end. If, on the other hand, it's a real effect that's associated with the climate, maybe it occurred earlier on, maybe it only occurs during warm periods. Well, that's okay, because we're looking at the cooling during volcanic events and the cool period, the so-called Little Ice Age of the last few hundred years. We're not going back to the previous warm period, so we don't mind if our record is not so good at capturing that. So, in conclusion, we have some other evidence that our record is reliable, in that here we've got our record reproduced by Leah Schneider et al. In a paper a few years back. Ours is in the mustardy colour there, and they have a different data set that has very little overlap with ours in blue. Theirs doesn't have this post-1960 divergence, at least not anywhere near as strong as ours does. And yet if you look back over the preceding few centuries, you see good agreement between the two records. So I don't think that our record has had any of these previous phases affecting it. So we're now going to move to another data set. This is now going back further in time. So what I've showed you there, the Schweingruber network, they were all sampled from living trees. So you're limited in how far you can go back according to the lifespan of each tree. Might be a couple hundred years, maybe, as we saw, back to 1400 AD in a few cases. So let's move now to northern Russia, to the Yamal Peninsula and the northern part of the Ural Mountains. And here's another data set collected by colleagues in Russia, Hantamirov, Kurdyanov, Mazepa and Shiatov. 800 Siberian larch, living but also now subfossil trees. These are trees that have died, but they haven't rotted away. They are preserved in some manner, either because it's so cold and dry that they just don't rot, or because they're preserved in, they've fallen in some sediment and been preserved in that way. And 800 trees, and they span a couple of thousand years, not individually, but the record as a whole does, because some of them are dead and lived 2,000 years ago, some are dead and lived 1,500 years ago, etc., and we can build them up and cross-date them precisely. It's a very cold environment. Again, we're on the margins of survival. You can see that the trees are rather sparse, although with the recent warming of the last 4 decades, you can see by comparing the photographs the new growth of forest in this region. And so what do these trees look like in terms of their record of growth, and what do we learn about temperature in this region from them? So the top panel is the last 1,000 years or so, with a kind of a filter to smooth out everything below 30 years. So these are the multi-decadal fluctuations in tree growth. And you can probably see, if you look closely in the top right-hand side, we've got the observed temperature in red from our thermometer record. And the agreement is good, correlation of 0.7, 0.75. You can see visually, hopefully, there's agreement in the timing of those warm and cool decades. And this takes us back 1,000 years or so. And then the lower panel is the whole 2,000 years with a longer running mean of 50 years or so. So we can learn something about how warm the summers were in this part of the world. And that is very much related to internal variability of the climate system, fluctuations in the weather from one period to another. If we want to look specifically about external forcings that drive the climate externally, like greenhouse gases, like the volcanic eruptions, like changes in the sun, we can tease out much more detail about those fluctuations, again, if we average spatially. So we take our record and we, together with a consortium called N-Trend, led by Rob Wilson and Kevin Anchukaitis, we put our record from the Yamal Polar Urals region together with other records, and again developed a northern hemisphere-wide record of past summer temperatures. But now, not just limited to the living trees that we looked at before, but going back 1 or 2,000 years. And the comparison with observed temperatures, which are in red, shown in the top panels there in terms of the level of agreement, and then the bottom panel shows our reconstruction across the hemisphere for the last 1,300 or so years. And we can, again, learn something about the climate. We can look at the amount of warming recently. We can look at the timing of cool periods and its association with periods where volcanic activity was greater or periods where we think the sun's energy was less. And this came out in 2016, but prior to this, we already had a number of records, and in the IPCC, we assessed those records that were available up until 2012, 2013. And this grey smudge is a composite of all these different studies in terms of their estimates of how warm or cool the Northern Hemisphere was through time. And we can see some things. We can see what we call the medieval climate anomaly, the generally warmer conditions. We see the Little Ice Age from kind of 1450 to 1850, generally cooler conditions, and then the warming as we come into the 20th century, and so on. So before we say what can we learn about the details of this, we can step back and say, actually one thing we can learn is the climate has been remarkably stable. These fluctuations are kind of 0.5 degree Celsius or so. So if we shrink the diagram down and we compare what may happen in the coming century, or the rest of the century, if we don't mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions, you can put those projections, kind of 2 to 6 degrees of additional warming, in the context of what the world has experienced in the last 1,000 years. So that's already something we can learn. The climate has been pretty stable compared to what it may be doing this century. Of course, we can think more details about this particular record. For example, a very common question is the 20th century warmer than the medieval period? So taking into account the uncertainties and also adding on the temperature record from the thermometers onto the end, which isn't shown here, but which confirms how warm the late 20th century was. The assessment in the IPCC report was that it was very likely that the modern period is warmer than the last 600 years, and likely that it's warmer than the entire period shown here. And we had moderate confidence in that conclusion. You might think perhaps we should have more than moderate confidence, but remember these systematic errors. These error ranges here are not the full uncertainty, and so therefore we have to be cautious. Again, we can assess our climate models. So the grey band is is the evidence we have from the real world, and then climate model simulations predict the Northern Hemisphere temperature over the last 1,000 years, and you can see there's good agreement. Secondly, I haven't shown it here, but if you didn't include increasing CO2 and other greenhouse gases as a forcing in this model, they wouldn't capture the warming in the 20th century. So that helps us to pin down the causes of 20th century warming. You can see some of these cool periods, the 1800s, the 1450s, associated with volcanic eruptions. And there's two batches of climate model simulations here, in red with strong fluctuations in solar variability in the past, and blue with weaker fluctuations. The truth is we don't know how strong the changes in the sunshine have been over the last 1,000 years precisely. But either of those two records is a good match to our reconstructions data. So I'm going to finish off by moving to the other end of the ecological range. So we're going to leave UEA and head across to the northeastern Tibetan Plateau, to a very arid environment, typical annual rainfall of 250 millimetres a year. So Norwich is about 675, and we're one of the drier places in the UK. So here we are on the Kilian Mountains, northeast Tibetan Plateau, very arid, very long-lived trees. These are juniper trees. Typically, they may last 500 years. Some of the samples are growing continuously for more than 1,500 years. Also very dry, so when they die, they tend to rot. So there are samples back in time that are dead and still standing there, that have been sampled by my colleague, Professor Bao Yang, and many of his colleagues in Langzhou in China. Again, another brilliant data set to work with, and this is what we can infer from it. It's so dry here that the trees care about how wet it is. And the correlation between observed rain gauge records of annual rainfall and the tree growth in the last 60 years is 0.84. So remember, correlation of 1 would be a perfect agreement. So this is an excellent record, and it's also very long. 2014, we published the record going back 3,500 years. This is the reconstruction for that whole period in the lower panel. You can see the changes, the modern high growth inferred to be high precipitation. And then the top panel is every year for the last 400 years. So you can get an idea of the variability and how well we can reconstruct that. So what can we learn from this? Well, the highest growth rate in these trees for the last 3,500 years is the last 50 years. Possibly that means that that is the wettest period on the record. I say possibly because CO2 concentrations have been higher in the last few decades than previously, and maybe there's a CO2 fertilization effect. On the other hand, the observed precipitation has gone up over that 60 years. So probably there's a combination of those effects. One other thing we can do is we can take those grey smudges that I had for the Northern Hemisphere temperature before, which are repeated here, and we can overlay the precipitation reconstruction from these trees in northeast Tibet and compare the two of those together. The top showing the full record, and then the lower panel is the same thing, but I've filtered out this millennial scale fluctuation, this warming to the medieval, the cooling to the Little Ice Age, and the modern warming. I filtered that out in the bottom to see whether there's agreement, even if you take that away. Correlations, 0.4, 0.5, which is reasonable because we expect lots of things to influence the rainfall here. We don't expect one thing to affect it. So but what this is saying is that during periods where this region was wet, that coincides with periods when the Northern Hemisphere was warmer than average. And when this region was dry, the Northern Hemisphere cooler than average. So that's telling us about some of the climate dynamics behind this. And I want to finish with one last example, if I have time. I think I have time. So this is what we published in 2014, 3,500 years. And the bottom panel is the number of trees that Bao Yang and his group had sampled that have a ring in any 1 year. I mean, thousands of trees in total, but in this period here, there's 400, 500, 600 trees, and a diminishing number further back. But still high, still tens or even hundreds. And since then, they've sampled even more. The record now goes back 5,350 years, and we're working on a paper with Professor Yang, and the red series there is what we're currently looking at from these new data, and the blue is the published data from 2014. Again, the highest growth period in this record is the last 50 years. So thank you for listening. I hope I've given you a flavour of what we can learn from our observations of the Earth. Important thing to remember as a starting point is we need to have good records, and for that we're very grateful to all these colleagues around the globe who have developed over many years and decades these amazing data sets. I won't repeat all the things we've learnt, they're just in these categories. How has the climate varied? What factors can explain these changes? And can we test our models to see if they're reliable? And so thank you for that. And I just want to point out that we have a recent piece published about Keith Briffer, who sadly died last year, in tree ring research. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. A most fascinating talk. Amazing data sets indeed. So you're a data person then, it seems. Okay, great chance to ask the expert a couple of questions. By the way, I'm Kevin Hiscott, the head of school. It's my pleasure to ask the audience for any questions they may wish to ask Tim. Yes, Lee.
So when you showed the graph about the tree rings
I think the thermometer record is quite reliable in that period. If there was going to be a difference arising from problems. Yeah, I think we've got fairly good, reliable records for that period. And I would say that the way we do the calibration, I don't know if you noticed, although there was this increase in divergence between the two, the year-to-year fluctuations remained correlated with each other. So we tend to detrend everything, remove the long-term changes, and instead calibrate it against the year-to-year variability, which isn't affected by that divergence. Yes, so we've got a good relationship with volcanic activity. We've got a less clear relationship with solar variability. In terms of beyond the climate, other people have tried to relate these things to changes in civilizations, as in have these climate variations influence civilizations. So with that Chinese record, for example, our Chinese colleagues are looking into the timeline of Chinese civilizations in those regions to see whether the dry periods correspond to any particular downturn in civilizations. But there's so many influences on civilization, as you're probably aware. You know, it's not just climate, there are so many social factors as well that it's quite a difficult thing to do.
Well, are there any other questions? Okay, you get your supplementary question.
Over those time periods, the number of human beings on the Earth must have increased immensely, and it will be a very steeply rising curve over the last few years. If mankind is a major cause of that, could you not see quite a major change in that periodicity that I was talking about, related to estimates of what human and animal populations there may have been?
Yeah, you could be right, there could be some influences along those lines. Obviously forests closer to civilization will show much larger impacts of those changes in population. Given that many of these have been sampled fairly distantly from where people tend to live, then that influence is reduced, but I agree it's not necessarily zero. And the indirect effect I mentioned at the end there, that our burning of fossil fuels has raised CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and that can, of course, affect plant growth through their photosynthesis. And there's not very strong evidence, I don't think, for it affecting tree rings in the colder, wetter climates. But in that last example where we're in a very arid climate, that is the kind of place where higher CO2 in the atmosphere would most likely affect tree growth, because CO2 fertilization affects trees by increasing their water use efficiency. So if they're stressed because it's so dry, then maybe that's where you'd see a signal.
Okay. There's one last question, yes. Did you want to ask a question?
I think Roger had a question.
Yeah, one of my favourite stories is the Mount Tambora eruption in 1815, coincided with the end of a long war, and a certain Mary Shelley and her husband went on their holiday to France in 1816, and it absolutely poured with rain the whole summer, so they stayed inside and they told each other stories, and this was the origin of the story of Frankenstein. Now, I'm just wondering how I can turn that into a question, but you are aware of that, aren't you?
Yes, you can see in this panel here, 1816, these purple colours across mainland Europe at the cooler end of our colour scale here. That does match in with what you say.
It's worth actually commenting that there could be some mass deaths also there's some deep human tragedy underlying some of these.
And that's why we should be so worried about climate change this century, because of the societal impact. So I think we'll leave the questions there for now. We have a chance to meet Tim in the reception out in the foyer in a moment.
Could I just, in case I didn't say it during the talk,
Yep.
we have some samples of some of these chewings on display out there, so do have a look at those when you're having your drink afterwards.
Can we touch them?
Oh, no. One of them is 7,000 years old.
Right, okay. I stand corrected. Okay, just one short announcement to make here before we have our reception. Luna Filipovic's inaugural lecture was on the relationship between language, thinking, memory and judgment. That was scheduled for the 27th of February. It didn't actually happen, but it has been rescheduled for Tuesday, the 22nd of May. So if you want to hear Luna Filipovic, then the 22nd of May, that's the date for her inaugural lecture. But just for now, just to say, well done, Tim, and we should just give you one round of applause for your successes today. Well done.